started now, and so I thank everybody. But as I said, we have close to 50 people registered, but it's being recorded, so we note that a lot of people come in later and they review it. It's kind of interesting. We've been doing these webinars. I've been doing these webinars for about the last 2 years or so, and coming up with different topics that people I think are interested in, and create kind of a community around work-based learning and structured on-the-job training and Situate and everything. And we've been repeating some of these topics, but then I came up with this realization that there may be an interest in the topic that is of the focus today, and that's occupational standards, apprenticeships, and training. It seems like kind of an obscure topic, and I didn't know if everybody else would get the meaning as much as I see the meaning. So, but as it turned out, there has been much interest in connecting these topics here. And before we get started, we're sort of preaching to the choir here because everybody here, I think, shares some interest in the same topics. But all of you know that there has been, at least I am aware of this because of my position and being able to talk to people from a lot of different places around the world, that there is a global awakening to apprenticeships. Part of it has to do with COVID and the delay and reskilling and all those kinds of things, but there is a changing nature of work, is a dramatic shifts, and getting people into the workplace with the right skills. It's a huge, huge challenge, and it's not just here in the West, in the US, but it's all over. And it's just an important thing. We know that to be true. The current systems that we have, good morning, Carrie. Glad that you could join us. The current systems are working for the most part, from my perspective, but I don't know from a judgment perspective, are they sustainable, which is something that's driven me to offer this opportunity for discussion and coming together. One of the issues that I see, and we're going to talk about this more, is that a lot of times from a school or an intermediary perspective, apprenticeships are more than administration of the programs alone. There's other aspects that we're going to talk about. And one of the things that I just came back from a long trip to the Middle East and the Gulf region is that I kept telling people that this is our time. Societies are looking to us to help impact what's going on. And I don't know if everybody feels that, but I certainly do. And it's almost imperative to some extent. Well, I wouldn't say it to some extent, to a large extent. Oriana is saying hi to Rich. There's a connection there. That's nice. That this is our time more than any other time. And obviously, it's upon us to do well, to do the things that societies expect us to do in terms of helping people enter the workforce. So that's a little bit of perspective that I come from in all of this. I just noticed I got this email yesterday from the Department of Labor. There's much more interest in apprenticeships, as most of you know, from our government's perspective. When I was in Saudi Arabia 2 weeks ago, I helped everybody understand that it was National Apprenticeship Week from the Department of Labor. Now, it was kind of surprising for people in Saudi Arabia to realize how much interest the government was taking in that activity and everything. Well, as all of you know, the introduction for this particular webinar has to do with occupational standards. And occupational standards is something it drives a lot of people in terms of what they rely upon and what they think is appropriate. But we have to understand what they are and what they can do and what they cannot do. One of the things that they can do, as we're going to discuss a little bit more, is that they can inform schools in terms of curricula and things like that. But occupational standards are of no use at all and relevance to most employers. And this is one of the big issues that I have seen repeatedly. I became aware of this a number of years ago when I was doing consulting with the government of South Korea. and with the national competency standard system that they have there. And the disconnect between the occupational standards and what employers are actually doing relative to those standards was glaring and affected eventually the effectiveness of the apprenticeship process. And so it's an interesting insight for people who have been involved in these programs and these initiatives over time, but I think it's something that needs to be discussed, and hopefully we can do that today. I have had an interesting recent experience, if I can share with you very quickly. In the last couple of weeks, I spent most of my time in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is experiencing over 20% growth in their GDP. It's a very fast growing country. We hear a lot of things about it, but it has changed dramatically in terms of its social policies. It is a different country than it was the last time that I've been there, and in a lot of respects. And as all other places around the world, the emphasis on apprenticeships is dramatic. I had the opportunity to speak at the Riyadh Technical College, which is the premier part of the TVTC system in Saudi Arabia. I've given you the links if you're interested in knowing more about these institutions, but they're about to embark on a big contract with the Boston Consulting Group to develop an apprenticeship system nationally. And, for good and bad, people get involved in these consulting firms. Some of you might be interested in that as well, but they're not sure how to judge exactly what it is that they will be getting. I also had the chance to meet with a number of senior people at the HRDF. HRDF in Saudi Arabia is the primary workforce development entity. It's similar to ones in other countries. We really don't have one here in the US like the HRDF because it taxes companies and it returns money based on training. It helps job seekers. It does a lot of different things at the national level that maybe our states do here in the US. But there is a strategic vision towards something happened to my video. Sorry about that. There's a strategic vision for using OJT, which is one of the reasons that I was asked to come. And then I've also been involved because of Situate. Our business is a very large technical college called the Maharat Construction Training Center, which is in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. And they're involved with Aramco, and in terms of making sure that contractor employees are qualified to be on site and things like that. And as a national company and such a powerful entity in that country, they are willing to do almost anything to ensure at the national level a skilled workforce and make investments in that way. I only share this with you because I had sort of the opportunity to go the whole gamut from the TVET perspective to the national workforce development perspective to the technical school perspective, and also from the private sector perspective as well, about their perspectives in this particular situation. My comments today will be based on large part on a book that I wrote 2019 having to do with work analysis in the knowledge economy. I haven't seen any other resource that talks about occupational standards, occupational analysis as it's being done in a contemporary sense today. And I'm not trying to sell you the book, but it is a resource that a lot of people have found useful. When I do workshops on most any parts of that the book becomes a great resource for the workshops. If you're interested, you can find it on Amazon and almost any place. Let's talk about, from my perspective, what an occupational standard is. This is not a lecture. If you want to break in, this is fine, but I want to get through this as fast as possible. So hopefully there will be some discussion at the end as well. Some of you may or may not have given much thought to occupational standards other than to look at one after it's finished. But I've been involved in the development of them and understand some of the decisions that people make. Basically, an occupational standard obviously is a way of describing that occupation. And from a, you make some decisions about what information to include, all the way from prospects like you might see on ONET to salary information to trends, all those kinds of things. One of the things we have to be clear about is that an occupation is defined differently from a job. And this is sometimes difficult when I go to other cultures, because in other languages, distinguishing between the word job and the translation for word occupation is something sometimes different. So we have to make sure from our perspective that an occupation represents how a particular related job occurs over different settings, not one setting, but a number of settings. And a job is something that occurs within one setting. And this is the definition, the operational definition that I use to make sure that there's clarity between that. A standard should be based on an occupational analysis, and it should be systematic. And I'll kind of make some comments about that in just a few minutes. But we also know that an occupational standard is used differently by different stakeholders. We have seen that pretty clear. When you do an occupational standard for government agencies, it could forecast priorities and trends and all those kinds of things, and forecast the future in terms of new employers coming into the regions and things like that. Occupational standards are very important for developing curricula and programs in technical schools and in education providers. And in South Korea, especially, the national competency standards is used for career awareness, helping people understand what are their options in terms of future job opportunities. And companies use occupational standards sometimes for lines of demarcation and HR kind of purposes and things like that. They can be used for benchmarking and things like that. But as you look down that list, it has less power the further you go into it. It has much more power to influence what happens in government agencies and educational institutions than it does in the private employer sector. That's for sure. We know that for sure. In the book that I wrote, and I did a pretty systematic analysis of occupational standards. I'm not going to go into this, but there are examples that seem to shake out in the three categories. Occupational standards can establish and document an entire occupation. For example, cybersecurity technician, a technical support person, or something like that. So those are occupations, an entire occupation. Another set of occupational standards looks interestingly at some areas of competence across different occupations, like computer skills, those kinds of things. And so it has a different intent than looking at the entire occupation. And then there are some occupational standards that just focus, kind of related in this, to the prerequisites of what are necessary to enter the occupation, or I guess you could say the job as well. So sometimes you get a little confused when you look at any given occupational standard. Is it focusing on the entire occupation, or some kind of horizontal row of information across related occupations, or some other information? Sometimes you're not sure if the people who did the standard really understood that was a little different intent that they had than the expectation of having the entire occupation documented. Some of the issues that I see with occupational standards is, unfortunately, there's no standard for a standard. I have looked at a lot of different standards from a lot of different places here in the US and around the world, and they all look different. They use a different terminology. That's good and bad, I guess, but there is just no standard for the standards. And so people can can say that this is a representation of the occupation. And it's almost like a buyer beware kind of thing, that schools that may have contracted with an agency to, or somebody that's contracted with a consulting agency to do this kind of work, really don't know exactly what to expect in return. It's a buyer beware. And in my experience, there is only one or two criteria to think about when you're doing this, and that is to think about how it will be used. You know, I can remember a quick story back in the mid 2000s, and I was working, doing some consulting in South Korea as the national competency standard was being developed, and they were coming up with a template for the standard and everything. And there was quite a few arguments, you know, what should we include? They said, well, the UK models have this, New Zealand's models do that, and they include this information. And so people were kind of wrestling with what should be in the standard. And I realized that there really is only one way of determining that question. What should be in it is, what is it going to be used for? What's next? And that's the driver. And it may not be the same driver in Britain as it is in South Korea or the US or North Carolina or wherever the standard would be used and how it would be used. The other aspect that I have told clients about is that you cannot do a standard and then give it to the client without a proof of concept. In other words, if you develop the standard and you have a purpose for the standard, then it's incumbent upon the consultant to run the logic in a sense. In other words, show that it actually informs curriculum planning, if that was the goal. And that is very seldom done. I have very seldom seen that aspect done. And what you're doing there is that you're testing whether or not the process that you used and the outcome that you achieved really makes any sense. Is it going to be usable? So these are some of the issues. Maybe you have some issues too, and maybe this is a little bit overwhelming in terms of information, but it's good to reflect on some of these things that we follow. And if you're in the process of thinking about occupational standards in some respects, to really think about what it is that you're doing and how you're planning the next steps with that. Just a quick word about, you know, where we are with apprenticeships. All of us know that their apprenticeships globally have these two components, the RTI component and the work-based learning component. In my work, I am more focused on the work-based learning component because I think that's where people and employers have the most difficulty, and it's really the impact in terms of students and apprentices when they go through the process. What did they learn in the actual setting? I have talked to a lot of different groups, but primarily, I guess, unfortunately, to some extent, my primary groups of my audiences have been educational institutions and government agencies. And I don't get a chance. I do speak to employers, but it's not always about apprenticeships. But most of my discussions about this have been with intermediaries, educational institutions, and some registering agencies. But there is clearly, employers need to be part of this discussion of what's happening here. And this is just information that most of us know about the different types. But I think that, you know, when you think about the kinds of issues that we're discussing, that I'm raising here, this really is much more appropriate for thinking about the competency-based and the hybrid kind of apprenticeships that we see today. People in Saudi Arabia, they found it quite interesting to distinguish between the competency-based because they began to realize the amount of work that they still needed to do in terms of making sure that their competency system or their apprenticeship system was really based on what was happening among employers and currently and in the future. Well, I want to be critical here without hurting anybody's feelings and everything. But here's the situation that we have. We have, as I've raised the issue, a lot of different variations of occupational standards that are meant to describe what that occupation is about, to show what are the related technical instruction, the prerequisites, and all those kinds of things. This is an example. I'm not going to say it's a fine example or an average example, but I am going to say I don't know if it meets my criteria of saying, does it inform the next step for the users? And that's a problem. And the other aspect of that is whether if I showed this standard to an employer, how would it inform their practice? How would it match up with what they do in terms of whatever occupation or the job that's represented in that organization? And that's a real problem. So when we think about apprenticeships from the employer perspective and training, I see all these issues, and like I say, we can be very critical about the system, but we know that the system is valuable and working. Is it sustainable in the way that it's going right now? There's a lot of issues in terms of support, in terms of what goes on inside of employers, making sure that the learning expectations for the apprentices are clearly made explicit, whether the learning in the organizations, the learning that's done in the organizations is connected to the standard, because that's the way the credentials are given, how the RTI and the work-based learning is connected, who's accountable, responsible, and how do we evaluate the results, not only from the perspective of employability and for the apprenticeship perspective, but I also am concerned about evaluating apprenticeship systems in terms of contributions back to the employers as well. What do they get from the system? What is it that they benefit from? And those are some of the issues that are important for me as I have connected with different people. There's three major recommendations I'd like to throw out, and then we can stop, and I only have a few more slides, but there's three major recommendations that I've been telling people that I think are important. The first one is that we have to realize that any occupational standard is not going to represent what happens in a particular employer situation. And therefore, we have to take that occupational standard, which was based on an occupational analysis, and do a quick job analysis to understand what is happening inside that employer. So in other words, the occupational standard is one document for a purpose, but then we need to connect it with a little bit more analysis in terms of what's happening with that job within the employer situation. Because when you look at the right side of the slide, these are the things that are of value and of relevance to the employer. The occupational standard, I have never seen an employer be able to develop a training program based on an occupational standard. Now, what we have done is that we've developed some crosswalk tables that connect after we've worked with employers and done a job analysis, quick job analysis, and identified the tasks, and to do a matrix like this to be able to connect the parts of the occupational standard with the actual tasks. And I can talk about this. We could spend the whole time talking about this table, but what it does is it's a verification that what tasks in that employer setting are actually connected to the occupational standard. It provides a training plan for the apprentice, and it shows what gaps there might be in terms of what additional things the apprentice might have to have in addition to the actual work-based learning experience within an employer setting. So this has become very important. People that see this realize it's really logical. But first of all, you have to realize that you have to do a little bit more work to make sure that the training plan for the apprentice is embedded and anchored both in the practice of the organization and also the standard as well. The other table that we obviously come up with is to connect the RTI with the various tasks that are done. So that way that when you're helping the apprentices understand why they are taking certain courses, these are the reasons, because they connect to these tasks that you are going to be learning. So the first thing that we think is important is that as a recommendation is that we think the occupational standard is a very useful document, but it's not the end when you're working with a particular with employers. More work has to be done, and it's almost always on the burden of the schools or intermediaries to make that happen. Okay, this sounds like an ad, and I apologize. It's true, but we do have to support the work-based learning better than we have in the past. And honestly, there's no other training approach than structured on the job training. It's pretty clear from a national perspective, from places that I've gone, people will realize OJT is critically important, and understanding the importance of structured on the job training is even more important. And when you do this job analysis and identifying the tasks, you are halfway there to being able to develop more structured on the job training. I gave a presentation to the Asian Development Bank a couple months ago, and a lot of the people that were in attendance were people from community colleges, technical schools. And I said, this kind of leads into my next point here too, is that you have to engage, you have to help the employers. A lot of times the employers don't have the means for their own employees, the training approaches for their own employees. So we expect them to provide quality training to the apprentices, and it just won't happen. So it's important for us to support work-based learning to the extent possible within the employer setting. The last thing I've talked a lot about in presentations is that apprenticeship programs is more than just setting up and recruiting students, getting people into the program, administering, making contact with employers, having events. On LinkedIn, you can see lots of examples of celebration events and people coming together, which is great because it shows engagement between schools and the employers, different sectors, stakeholders. But I'd like to see a different kind of engagement with employers. And that's where the schools become much more oriented towards consulting. They have the position to be able to do some of the work analysis, job and task analysis, the occupational standards, helping organizations implement better OJT systems, maybe even evaluate their programs better. The schools are in a unique position, but they have to realize it's up to them maybe to increase their professional skills in these areas as well. It's a big challenge. And I think in the right kind of relationships between employers and schools, I believe that the employers are looking for that assistance and would welcome that assistance if it was offered to them. So these are three things that I think are important from some of the issues that I've raised. I think we need to, first of all, adapt the occupational standards, not to rely upon them as the cure-all for all parts of the system. I think we need to make sure that we support the work-based learning that's going on in the organizations, because most of the time they don't have their own training approaches well established for their own current employees. And finally, I'd like to see the providers, the education institutions, step up a little bit more forcefully in engaging with employers a little bit more than just as administrators and just coordinators of the total event, or of the total initiative. So anyways, that's what I would like to share with you today. There's a lot of information that I've thrown at you, somewhat controversial a little bit. The last thing that I would say is that I have a particular perspective on this, and it's formed by my background in HRD, my background in work analysis, and also in working with community colleges. And so I have sort of been able to bridge some of the different entities, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about is people being employed and employers being happy and welcoming and giving those young apprentices the learning opportunities that they're hoping to get. So I'm going to leave it at this point and open it up for any discussions that you might have. And if you're interested, we can talk about any of this, and I'll go back and clarify this as much as you wish. I know we have not everybody that signed up, but we have quite a few here. Are there any thoughts, questions? Does anything here resonate with your experiences? I'm going to call on Rich because it looks like his microphone's on, but please, this is, everybody can chime in. Hi, Debbie. I don't know where you're from, but you came in last, so I'll say hi to you.
Hi.
Hi, where are you from?
Asheville.
Oh, you're another North Carolina person.
Yes.
Yeah, very nice. How's the weather there? Is it nice?
Today it's better, but it's a little chilly.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I think your colleague is on too. Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll speak up. Good
Go
morning,
ahead.
everybody. My name's Beth Dawson. I'm from Manufacturing Works in Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh,
We're an intermediary. We represent about 1,400 manufacturing companies in Northeast Ohio. And we became a sponsor of Registered Apprenticeship in 2016. In the last couple of years, we've had tremendous growth, which aligns well, Ronald, with what you spoke about with regard to COVID. And a lot of what you said resonates. You know, we've got, we're in the process of developing our redeveloping our program standards, and trying to add a couple new occupations. And we know that, certainly know the value of the apprenticeship training, connecting the RTI to the work-based learning experience, the importance of the role of mentor in that learning. I can share with you, and I'll drop a couple links in the chat, but we started a training, offering a training for frontline supervisors that just has been so well received by the manufacturing community. And we're looking at developing another program that kind of does a deeper dive, and then even another training that's more specific to apprenticeship mentoring. But we know how important that trainer is to the apprentice's experience. The other thing I'll share, because I just think it's going to be interesting to folks that are on this webinar is next week we're hosting a webinar, the National Institute for Innovation and Technology. Got some funding from the National Science Foundation. They developed a platform, a $10 million platform called the National Talent Hub. And they're going to do a demonstration for our members next week. I will drop that link in the chat as well. But the National Talent Hub is relevant to manufacturers or employers, I should say, and job seekers and educators. So an individual can load their knowledge, skills, and abilities onto this platform, and an employer can look at that individual's competencies and say it, and the platform will say they're about 90% qualified for your job. And it does additional analytics that tells the individual what competencies they need in order to be qualified for that job. Very, very interesting platform that also informs education on what do they need to do to adjust to what the employer's needs are in terms of developing programming. So thanks for having this webinar, and I appreciate this information.
Yeah, this is important to share. Just from a personal perspective, we spend about 6 months out of the year in Lakeside, Ohio.
Oh yeah.
So starting in May, if you'd like to connect, I'll be there.
It's a nice area.
Yeah. So let me know. Maybe I can stop over sometime. So not in the winter time. I'm not available.
Right. No, not there.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the comments. Thank you you just posted the webinar. It sounds very interesting. This is interesting about, the linking that you said about the RTI and the work-based learning. What the Riyadh Technical College, which is a huge campus, it's like a university campus, but what they've done, in a sense, to kind of avoid some of the messiness of working with employers, is that they've set up workshops within the technical school that serve the work-based learning purpose. And because they have a wealth of funding, they can duplicate what they think is what's happening in the workplace, but keep it under control within the setting. And like you say, in terms of the training of the mentors, the trainers, and all those kinds of things, that's a big ask for in some cultures that don't have the experience, or if the school doesn't have the experience, to go out there and say, we can do that and help you do that. And one of the things that I told them, and there's about a dozen or so TVTC schools around Saudi Arabia. I said that every one of those curriculum offices in each school have to have experience in work analysis, job analysis. They have to be going out into the employer settings and finding out how the jobs are changing, how the occupation, what's the state of the occupation, so there's just a lot of opportunity, I think, for professional growth. I didn't mean to talk longer than it just spawned some things that made me think about what to add to what you said. But that's great. And I'm glad to hear that you're connecting with employers in meaningful ways. That's great. The occupational standards is just an interesting thing. Thank you, Beth, for posting all that information. My first brush with them was in the early 2000s and in South Korea, and realizing one of the issues that they were having is that the government was spending a lot of resources in developing these standards, and many of the major companies in South Korea, LG, Hyundai, Kia, SK, all the major employers, and Samsung, of course. But when it came down to it, none of the large companies or any of the companies, even the SMEs, were adopting the standard. They were supporting the standard, but they weren't adopting the standard. And it really frustrated the country, the national, agencies, because they said, we've gone to all this trouble to do all this analysis, and now you're not taking it into consideration for what you're doing. And it was pretty obvious to me why there was that disconnect, but it was a bit of a learning experience. There's only so much application and relevance that those standards really have without some modification. Would anybody else like to comment? One thing that's unique about the United States, I should mention personally, when I was at Ohio State University, part of my time there, I was the director of the Center on Education and Training for Employment. Tell you a quick story. And CETE is the internationally known venue for DACM and workforce development solutions and things like that, and fairly well known. And as director for a number of years, I used to get letters and emails from people saying, mostly from international scholars, and say, well, we would like to come and, set up, be a scholar in residence. And we're here to study the United States workforce development system. And I would show these letters to colleagues and I'd say, boy, these people are in for a big surprise, because when they get here, they're expecting to see this well-developed, integrated workforce development system. When they realize it's so fragmented by states, by trade associations, by government agencies, whatever you have, it's much more chaotic than almost any other country that you can think of. Japan, I guess, has some similar characteristics, but somehow it all works together. But I think we all know that from our experience. It's not a central agency. It'd be nice, but it doesn't work that way. Would anybody like to? Hi, Joe Young.
Hey, yeah, I have a question. Actually, I have two questions. And well, hello, everyone. I am with New Apprenticeship. It's apprenticeship intermediary. And with New Apprenticeship, I'm in charge of curriculum. So yeah, a lot of things that you discussed kind of tie into my work. So I often work with employers to design apprenticeship curriculum. And Ron, I really agree that the occupational framework is seldom being used for curriculum development. And so for that, you mentioned doing a quick job analysis, right? And actually, like how to conduct job analysis with employers, that has been our interest, like even to help them to create apprenticeship opportunities, because a lot of times, still like US employers, they're more used to hiring people with skill set they already need, right? So like having this apprenticeship, like entry level, who are less trained. So it's kind of hard for them to, I mean, some actually understand the idea better, but sometimes, they say like, well, we can't really have apprenticeships. And so anyways, all that to say, like having a job, how to conduct job analysis, that has been our interest. And actually for that, I actually read your book this week. I didn't really did that, for this webinar, but I was reading about your job analysis section for DACM. And that says, the process is normally 1 to 2 day process of working with a panel with SMEs and the facilitator. And that's more kind of, I guess it's not too long, but still it's a long process for busy employers. So wonder like how, that you mentioned like quick job analysis that can look like when we work with employers.
Well, that's a really good point. And it's probably inappropriate for me to say, but today is much different from when DACM was developed. DACM was developed in the 1970s, early 1970s. And really, when you entered a DACM process, you almost often came about from ground zero. You know, there was all the information about the occupation or the job that you were analyzing was all new, and you didn't have too many other resources to be able to rely upon. But today, we have so many different ways of building knowledge about jobs and occupations, even before you get in with the subject matter experts and do the process. You know, we have ONET, we have the job search platforms, Monster and Career Builder and all those kinds of things. If you go and you have other countries that have done occupational analyses that are all available online, almost everything available in English you can get to in some way, because it's all public domain, you know, government sponsored. So I'm not saying that I'm a Superman, but I don't think that 2-day workshop rigid DACM thing works anymore. I think it can be done a lot easier in a half a day. In 3 or 4 hours, you can do things electronically. I'll put in a plug for Situate. Situate has the capability to help facilitate being able to do that remotely. So you could bring your subject matter experts together and do the job analysis, identify the duties and the task statements, and do the task analysis, and have everybody, you know, without having to worry about travel and all those kinds of things. I guess my point is, Juyang, as you know, is that there's too much out there that the analyst can bring to the table to reduce the time. And companies are not interested in spending all that time. Let me share with you, if you don't mind me sharing a story, what we are doing in Situate. You know, we're starting a pretty large project in Saudi Arabia, and the purpose of the project is to give credentials for people that work for contractors of Aramco and related companies. So when they come on site, there's some assurance that they have the credentials to do what they're doing. Welders, pipe fitters, people like that. But these companies don't have the time to do all this. And so what we are coming up with, I've not ever heard of this before. Rich, and I think you and I have talked about this in the past, maybe a little bit, is that when they get the license for Situate, the analysis, the training guides for the most part will be done. It'll be already pre-filled in the platform. And then we would go in and then fill in the details in the training materials, in the training guides, so that the task analysis is accurate and in the context of each, you know, a pipe fitter for one company like Larson Tube, the Indian company is very large in the area, and some Hyundai Heavy Industries, HHI, and a number of other companies as well. But so in other words, we can take on the burden so that the client, the contractors, have a ready to go product. And so in a sense, you're buying it already pre-filled with the assurance that we're going to keep monitoring the accuracy of the materials and things like that. It's almost, you know, from a change management perspective, we wouldn't want to do this forever and ever, although we might become pretty rich doing it. But what we would want to do is do it, let them experience it, and then slowly pass off, you know, the revisions and things like that. Because we're starting in February, we're going to start some workshops on job analysis and things like that. So in my last LinkedIn posting, I kind of alluded to the fact that we're going to try some approaches to SOJT that have never been done before. And this has never been done before, you know, to pre-fill the platform with content.
And very helpful, yes.
Yeah. And it's a way of opening the door for the companies, reducing their anxiety. Because when you show them a job analysis or an occupation, how that gets done is very difficult for a lot of people to understand. So we're going to take them by the hand. We're going to do it, help them do it, and pass it off to them. It may be something, Ju Young, from a change management perspective that you have to do to show that how it works, you know.
So Ron, if I could add something,
Go ahead, Rich.
and Hu Young, you could probably relate to this. You know, in the apprenticeship field, we're working with a lot of times small business owners.
Yeah, especially.
They're not the Microsofts and IBMs and all those big companies with all these training assets and expertise. So one of the things that I do is make sure I do a real quick and dirty kind of capabilities analysis with the companies to see if they have basic capabilities to leverage. Do you have a training manager? Do you have anybody? Do you have curriculum? What does it look like? How do you do it now? Really understand what we're plugging into. I mean, that's so important because you quickly overwhelm them with techniques and theories, even though everything that Ron has published in his books is gospel. Ron and I have known each other for years. I'm an HRD person and so forth, and it's seminal work, and it has to be adapted, of course, to the climate and environment that we're working with. So I think that's really important, is really understand what do you have to leverage that they have to make this stuff work, and then just input it accordingly. It's basic change management, and because a lot of people look at you, you're like, we don't have anything.
Right.
Training manager, what's that? You know.
and then, you know, a corollary to that is that when you put in they're welcoming an apprentice because they want to do their part. They're worried about the talent stream for their organization and everything. And then you put an apprentice in that system, in that organization, where there is no existing system for current employees. And then there's just a lot of standing around and things like that. You know, I think the labor unions probably have done the best job, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong, but in terms of skilled trades, because they've just had 100 years of experience doing this, and they control the inputs, process, and the outputs basically all along, you know, the system there. But you're right, a capability analysis. As you were saying that, Rich, it's funny because, you know, I've spent, I hate to say this, 40 years developing HRD professionals to work in organizations. And it just seems like every organization, you're still dealing with HR people that just have skills to administer programs, but not anything of any substance that we would be looking for. And so you have to start over.
Yeah, and I think that in the modern HRD world, my observation is that we're too heavily reliant on just content as our training methodology. There's very little analysis because everything is enabled through online learning. I mean, since online learning has been hit, I mean, the people just don't think about task analysis and competencies and how it fits into work. That work analysis is just devoid in many training operations. And so it is a problem. It's really a challenge for sure.
Well, yeah. And, you know, this you've seen this table before. We've discussed this, and this was for us kind of a breakthrough in our thinking. And it is on Situate in the platform as a planning document. But the idea here is that the platform will allow you to do an occupational analysis and will allow you to identify, or also to do a task analysis. And then it'll help you create this crosswalk to be able to connect what happens in the occupational standard and an employer. But you've got to be able to have the skills to work with the employers. And if it means hand-holding, then you have to do it.
A lot of that happening, right?
Right.
Well, this actually is a nice segue to my next question. we talked about like employers' capabilities and all that, and I can agree more about the employers, they needing more help with work-based learning, right?
Mhm.
That you mentioned that on intermediary needing to step up, rather even like a forcefully to support employers in that area. And I wonder what that looks like, and also kind of because in reality, as an intermediary, when we work with new companies, and we are very busy with just setting up RTI for them and even like educating them on apprenticeships itself because they're still new and all the logistics that kind of go into that. So
Mhm.
from that, even just helping them to become more efficient with the work-based learning. I don't know what that
Right, right. Well, that sounds like you've given me a segue into talk just a little bit about Situate, because I think the platform, and I'm sorry if this sounds like a commercial advertisement, but there's really no other platform that supports OJT like Situate does. It's based on my work with SOJT, but what it does is it allows you to manage, to develop the training, and to be able to deliver the training through the platform, either live and in person or live in remote situations. And it then manages, like the performance checks and all those kinds of things at the end of each task. Um, it just depends on the capability and the seriousness of the, any change process takes time. Apprenticeships, I'm kind of wandering in different directions, but apprenticeships have an interesting history, and they relied upon the master, to be in charge of what happened. And so we still have that feeling, I think, sometimes that the employer knows best, that we shouldn't interfere with what the employer does. But it's, we're dealing with young people, their lives, their careers, what's going to happen for them. I think it's just too important right now to be able to just leave it to chance. Orion, that's a great question. And part of that, my answer to that, when people ask me that question, is that, I've had meetings with people in the Department of Labor, and to them, interfering or imposing any kind of sense of standard in the private sector is totally the third rail. You don't you don't tell employers what to do. You don't give them standards or anything like that. We tried to use structured on the job training for one of the projects that they were using, and it didn't work. You can do it in other countries, but not in the United States. That's why I think that the proper place for giving this information is through the schools or even the intermediaries as well. And I can be critical because I'm kind of in the system, but not truly a part of the system. But I've seen enough of what happens. I think the schools in the non-credit side have a unique opportunity to step up. But for a lot of the schools, I think it's going to be professional development for them. I used to work a lot when I was at Ohio State with community colleges in the state of Ohio, and almost everybody involved in the non-credit side had a sales background, sales and marketing background, not an HRD or training background. So they were more interested in delivering results in terms of getting, bringing companies in and things like that, as opposed to helping the companies in a meaningful way. That's a long, maybe. What do you think, Orion?
Yeah, no,
it would be great
that.
if the Department of Labor, got involved.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, obviously apprenticeship is always employer driven, and the DOL has been pretty flexible, surprisingly, in terms of, what you can do to a work process schedule and how much you can change, et cetera. But
Mhm.
from the programs we've worked on, maybe 60% of the competencies will kind of mirror each other across the same occupation being apprenticed by different groups. But, you also don't want to go too far as to say, hey, you can kind of do whatever you want. To your point, you want there to be this standardization. We want certain skills to be kind of codified across an industry or across, the entire economy. And so I like the idea of like, maybe groups or intermediaries doing the analysis, but then they have to be codified. I mean, what is the approach to that, so that we can say, if you do an apprenticeship for this occupation and then you apply for a job in this occupation, you're bringing these transferable skills that everyone across these industries agrees on are necessary. And so I had asked another question earlier, which was kind of more about, how could this, your idea of this standardized occupational standards interact with a possible skills classification system, because there used to be a national skills classification board and that went away for some reason. But I just really like the idea of, like they do in these other countries, hey, these are the skills we're talking about specifically, and this is how they apply to different occupations.
Right. Well, that's when I talked about the different occupational standards, how they kind of shake out a little bit. So it's a really intriguing question, and I don't know if there should be one size fits all, but I think that the one size fit all is the question of how is this document to be used. I have never done a consulting project to do a job analysis, work analysis, or whatever, and that document was the end product. It's always used for something, it's always an in-process activity. And so you can't just say, okay, I'm going to give you a workshop on job analysis or something like that. The first question I ever ask a client is, what are you going to do with this information? What is it going to inform? And if it's for instruction, if it's for the RTI, that's fine. If it's for the training that might occur in the employer situations, that's fine. But it has, that dictates who you assemble together for your panel of experts. One other thing that might be of interest to everybody I didn't mention is that the skills gap analysis, we've done some forecasting using like job analysis, but what we've done is that we've changed the prompt question. The prompt question for a job analysis today is, what do people do on your job, on this job? Let's document what people do. You bring together a panel of job incumbents and supervisors and things like that. But if the prompt question was, what will be done on this job in 2 years from now? What that does is it changes, that prompt question changes the panel. But you have to know what's going on now to be able to say, how does that compare with what's going to happen in some future forecast, some future date? And, you have to bring in maybe vendors, customers, engineers, people like that. That's the fun part, to be able to then, if you're interested, Orion, I can send you, we did a presentation at the Academy of Human Resource Development. We did a study of 5 companies in Chicago, industrial companies, on the team leader position, and looked at a forecast of what's going to happen for that. And, but we did a current and then a forecast job analysis. And it just the process becomes like an OD intervention, because it gets people thinking maybe as they haven't really thought before. I give you a response that's more than you asked for, but
no, it's wonderful, and I appreciate you bringing up the slide again. Helps me kind of digest this stuff. And I was actually messaging Rich on the side about trying to connect with you, so
Yeah.
Love it. We'll just look out for an email from us.
Okay. Wonderful to hear from you. We're starting, we're doing some projects, and one of the projects we have to do is we have to provide training on some of these skills: job analysis, work analysis, SOJT, and those kinds of things. But that would be great. That would be great. Any other thoughts? Orion, send me an email and then we can be connected. I'm easy enough to find, or you can send it through LinkedIn. It's fine too.
Okay, we'll do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. A lot of times here in the US, we don't work with occupational standards maybe as much as people overseas do, because they have more, like in Canada, they have the sectors and things like that. But it doesn't mean that we don't have them. We still have them in some way or shape or form. I've told people the closest that we have for a national occupational standard is ONET. And it wasn't never intended to be for that, but it often is used in that way.
And that's typically where, we use ONET, in workforce development. I work for workforce board.
Right.
And working with, reps from the Office of Apprenticeship, they usually point to ONET as
Right. Right.
So
it's interesting. There's supposed to be some kind of AI platform that will, if you type in an occupational title, it'll go to Monster, it'll go to Career Builder, it'll go to all these and collect everything and bring it all together and synthesize it for you. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. But we've had clients say, isn't there an AI program that'll do all this for me? Why do I have to do all this work? And you just have to tell them, yeah, you have to kind of do all this work. Unfortunately. It's amazing though, how quickly you can, the task analysis part maybe takes a little bit more time, but the duties and the tasks, it can be done pretty quickly. Anyways, are there any other thoughts or questions about, we've kind of gone in a number of different directions. A couple of webinars ago, we focused only on work analysis, and that might be something we decide to do again. We try to space these out about every month and a half or so. The last one that we gave was an overview of Situate, the platform, and just kind of did a brief demo of in an informative way, not from a sales perspective, just to inform people about it. So we will decide, but if you have any interest in participating in our decision-making of what to do next, that's great. Probably wait until January after the holidays, then we'll schedule something at the end of the year. Orion, I just got your email, so I will respond to that. That's great.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much. Any other thoughts or questions? I see the people from Carrie, you're still there. If there's anything. Carrie, I'm maybe in your I'm in your neighborhood, so if there's anything we might connect on, please let me know. In North Carolina. So, James, are you still there, or did you fall asleep?
I'm here. Thank you so much. Yeah, very informative. Yeah, very. I'm thinking when you talk about the occupation standards. First, I'm coming from a polytechnic in China.
Yeah,
we have 22,000 students.
It's interesting. A few years ago, I was with the group in Beijing. I forget the exact name, but the vocational education, oh gee, I forget. I've told you, but they're investigating. There is no national competency system in China now. For occupations. And this was a group of the NIES, National Institute for Educational
Mm.
Services. It was a vocational education training group. And I came in and I was supposed to do a 2-hour presentation on occupational standards, and it ended up being an entire day. We just, it was like this discussion, it just continued and continued. And the original decision was to go ahead, and by the end of the day, they weren't so sure if a national standard was the best idea. It seemed
Yeah.
more regional approaches made more sense. But anyways, Carrie, did you have a comment of what was happening in your situation? I don't know if you're still there. Well, if you do, it'd be great. I'd love to interact with you and share with you more about what we're doing. In the meanwhile, I do appreciate all of the discussion. As I said, we had close to 50 people. We ended up with about 13, I believe, something like that. But it is going to be posted on either our website or on YouTube, not sure where, and it'll be up in about 3 or 4 days. So if there's any other comments or questions, we can probably close today.
I would just ask, Ron, when you post it, will you send out some communications to everyone who RSVP'd?
We will.
Okay.
You know, we have everybody's here, so you can take a look at it again. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Ju Young, it was great to interact with you. Best wishes to your efforts. And, you know, it sounds like you're confronting resistance from the companies in terms of being able to do all the things that you're asking them to do. And that's a tough ask. It's very difficult to do that. We are realizing the same thing and coming up with a different strategy, something I wasn't sure we really wanted to do, which was to do the work for them, but it may have to be done in order to get the process started.
Yeah, I look forward to your next webinar about job analysis. Hopefully you will do that soon.
Okay. Yeah, probably in January sometime.
Okay, sounds good. Thank
Sounds
you.
good. So thank you very much. It's nice to meet everybody new and look forward to maybe continuing the interactions with you in the future. So thank you, Carrie. Nice to meet you. Any information you can send along, that would be great. As far as we are done here, so appreciate your time. James, in China, you can go back to sleep.
Yeah, thank you so much. See you. Bye-bye.
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 Talk soon.
Meet you,
Bye-bye.
Leslie. Meet you, Leslie.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.